Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book of stars. Open up the
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking 2024. I'm your host, Sherry Horn Hassan of Karmic Evolution Astrology, and I'm coming to you on January 5th, 2024 from karmicevolution.com or any of your favorite podcast stations. I hope, like me, you all had time off during the holidays to enjoy with family and friends and to gear up for the year ahead, which will be bringing us many astrological occurrences and insights, hopefully to us all. And we'll get more into that in a minute, but first, my quick reminder that this show aims to bring you the truth about astrology and your soul's karmic evolution, and that a new podcast drops every Friday at 11 a.m. Pacific and 2 p.m. Eastern on most major podcast platforms. However, if you do listen to the podcast at karmicevolution.com, you'll see a downloadable freebie labeled How to Keep Your Sun Sign Happy, which is friendly advice for every sun sign from renowned evolutionary astrologer Stephen Forrest about what each of us, depending on our sun sign, needs to be happy. So be sure to grab it when you listen to this podcast, whether you do so live or after the fact, and enjoy some astrological words of wisdom. In addition, if you want to learn more about the true meaning of your individual birth chart, in order to gain greater consciousness about your soul's true mission and purpose, and what may be holding you back from achieving your highest destiny in this lifetime, I'm offering my 75-minute Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading for only $125, a discounted rate for podcast listeners only. So if you feel stuck, frustrated, or otherwise stymied in your relationships, your career, health-wise, or other areas of concern, and you want to learn why, then this reading is for you. If you'd like to understand how, by letting your unconscious script based on old soul-conditioned behaviors from the past run the show, and now want to become more conscious about how to change this script going forward, then this reading is for you. And if you'd like to co-create your own future happiness and success through astrological insight, then this reading is definitely for you. Conscious awareness has never been so easy or so affordable when you take advantage of my special discounted offer at karmicevolution.com/karmic125. That's karmicevolution.com/karmic125. And finally, as part of my housekeeping, I'd like to announce a lecture I'm presenting for the Astrological Society of Princeton on Sunday, January 14th, titled The Fight for Women's Equality in America, The History of the U.S. Sibley Chart's Chiron Return, Women's Rights, and the 2024 U.S. Presidential Election. And the description of the lecture is as follows. At its founding, America's laws did not include women in their concept of equality. From Abigail Adams' 1776 plea to her husband John Adams' "Don't Forget the Ladies," the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision on June 24, 2022, learn how the triggering of the U.S. natal chart's Chiron configuration illustrates this nation's long history of the fight for women's rights. This talk will first delineate the deeper meaning of these natal Chiron aspects in the U.S. chart and show how the wounded healer factors into this nation's history of woundedness related to equality in partnership. We'll then explore the incremental historical gains and setbacks for women's rights made during each of the first 4 U.S. Chiron returns, which occur approximately every 50 to 51 years, culminating with the historic Roe versus Wade Supreme Court decision in 1973, and how now the fight for women's equality has become an issue yet again since transiting Chiron once again activated the U.S. Chiron configuration when it squared the U.S. Cancer Sun on April 18, 2022. This occurred approximately 2 months before the U.S. Supreme Court's infamous June 24, 2022 Dobbs decision disregarding legal precedent and restricting the right of women to make decisions about their own bodies. This current triggering of the natal U.S. Chiron aspects into manifestation won't actually complete until February 18th, 2025, but will be heavily in play during the November 5th, 2024 U.S. presidential election. And that's because transiting Chiron retrograde will be waxing only minutes from its second exact return on November 7th, 2024, only days after the election. This lecture will explore through an astrological lens the November 5th, 2024 U.S. presidential election chart and whether American women will rally and use their hard-earned right to vote to set into motion the restoration of their individual right to bodily autonomy and equality for the future as Chiron makes its final exact return on February 18th of 2025. To find out more details and to sign up for this lecture, which will be recorded, so if you cannot make it live, you will most definitely receive the recording after the fact, simply go to aspnj.org. That's ASP for the Astrological Society of Princeton, NJ for New Jersey.org. And I hope to see you there or to have you enjoy the lecture after the fact if you are not able to make it. All right, so now let's get down to the astro news you can use for the current period. This week, right now, we're in the third quarter waning portion of the monthly lunar cycle since the full moon at 4 degrees and 58 minutes of Cancer on December 26th, which coincided as well with wounded healer Chiron's station direct at 15 degrees 27 minutes of Aries on that day as well. Now, Mercury retrograde in Sagittarius squared Neptune in Pisces then too, and met up with Mars in Sagittarius on December 27th. On December 28th, Mars in Sagittarius squared Neptune, while Venus entered Sagittarius December 29th, and Jupiter stationed direct at 5 degrees and 35 minutes of Taurus on December 30th. Now, the Sun in Capricorn since December 21st and Chiron station direct provide us both with the serious goal of speaking out about what has wounded us in the past. And with all that Sagittarius energy, which, is related to a number of things, but I think in the current atmosphere and the news that we've all been experiencing over the past 2 weeks or so can be read as related to righteous causes, particularly in the realm of law, higher education, immigration / foreigners, and other things, and religion related to all the Sagittarian Jupiter-ruled archetype. Now, with all that energy present at the sensitive, compassionate, nurturing Cancer full moon on December 26th, it was time to implore the cold, rigid, more restrictive Capricorn Sun, as political pundit Matthew Dowd put it recently when speaking on MSNBC about women's rights to bodily autonomy, to, and here I quote, "Let go of your belief systems and try to put yourself in the day-to-day world of those affected, involved. Let the people sitting in the room make the decision." So since we experienced the third quarter monthly lunar square of that Cancer full moon, and the lunar square was the Libra moon square the Capricorn sun on January 3rd, just 2 days ago, it's challenging us still now to work through integrating our need for compromise and partnership with our responsibility and commitment to be true to ourselves. These energies are best integrated by, as Matthew Dowd refers to, listening to our partner's needs and working cooperatively with them rather than against them. So before I get to next week's Capricorn new moon, which occurs at 20 degrees and 44 minutes in the sign of the sea goat at 3:57 a.m. Pacific time and 6:57 a.m. Eastern time on January 11th, I'd like to focus on the after effects of that Mercury-Mars conjunction and these two planets squares to Neptune in late December, just before Jupiter stationed direct at, as I said, I don't know if I said 5:34 or 5, but it was 5:34 Taurus on December 30th, followed by Mercury stationed direct at 22 degrees and 17 minutes of Sagittarius in that Jupiter-ruled sign on January 1st. In other words, Jupiter stations direct, Mercury does the same, but Mercury is transiting at the time through Jupiter-ruled Sagittarius. So I'm hoping you see the correlation. Now, at the same time, and this may sound like a digression, but it's not, so bear with me, I'd like to note the passing of renowned Jungian astrologer Aaron Sullivan, whose books I've quoted from numerous times on this podcast, and who was immensely helpful for me during my years of astrological study in order to hone the skill of reading charts and, understanding the correlation as above, so below, etc. Now, Aaron, known as the astrologer's astrologer, crossed over on December 11th at the age of 76. An integral member of Liz Green's Center for Psychological Astrology in London, she had an internationally acclaimed clientele and combined her classical studies background with training in archetypal analytical psychology, mostly Jungian, and culture studies in her 40-plus year career as an astrological writer, teacher, and consultant. She leaves us a legacy of 6 books, including one I quote from most frequently, Retrograde Planets Traversing the Inner Landscape. In addition, she gifted us with Saturn in transit, Boundaries of Mind, Body, and Soul, The Astrology of Family Dynamics, The Astrology of Midlife and Aging, Venus and Jupiter, Bridging the Ideal with the Real, and Where in the World, Astrocartography and Relocation, all of which are currently available on Amazon and which I highly recommend. Now, the reason I'm mentioning Erin, aside from paying homage to her incredibly fine astrological work, is to note that while preparing for this podcast, I was looking for a strong astrological indicator for some of the most shocking events that have happened this past week or so, but I didn't originally connect them to the Jupiter station. However, in preparation for this podcast, I was, as I said, pondering what could be the cause of several of the most shocking major news stories of this past week, including, for example, the attempted assassination of a South Korean politician. According to the Associated Press, and here I quote, South Korea's tough-speaking liberal opposition leader Lee Jae-myung, and forgive me for mispronouncing it, was stabbed in the neck by an unidentified knife-wielding man who attempted to kill the politician during his visit to the southeastern city of Busan, police said. Now, this occurred on December 27th, the day of the Mercury-Mars conjunction, which can manifest as, quote, someone who will act defensively toward you, according to astrologer Rob Hand. And that's from his book, Planets in Transit. Now, Lee, 59, the head of the main opposition Democratic Party, was airlifted to a Seoul hospital after receiving emergency treatment in Busan. Lee's party later said he was recovering at an intensive care unit at the Seoul National University Hospital following a 2-hour operation. That's also from the Associated Press. Now, the stabbing of South Korean opposition leader happened just 3 months before South Korea's upcoming general election. So clearly we see some of the political implications around the Sagittarian theme and the Jupiter station direct. In other news, NPR reported on January 1st that, and here I quote, in a narrow majority, Israel's Supreme Court struck down a law approved by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in July that stripped the court of its power to overturn government appointments and decisions. The measure sparked months of protests in Israel at the time. Demonstrators accused the administration of weakening government checks and balances. But the court said the law would cause, quote, severe and unprecedented harm to Israel as a democratic country. And NPR added that while Israel's government is dissatisfied with this ruling, officials suggest they won't do anything further to overhaul the country's judiciary while the country is at war with Hamas. Meanwhile, Israel's military also announced that it would withdraw thousands of troops from the Gaza Strip to focus on targeted operations against Hamas, as the nation is reportedly moving into a different phase of conflict, one that will focus on, quote, ensuring Hamas loses political control of Gaza and the means threaten Israel again, a more achievable goal than eliminating every Hamas agent, end quote. And on January 2nd, the New York Times reported, quote, a powerful magnitude 7.6 earthquake striking western Japan on New Year's Day, and police, firefighters, and military officials worked through the night to rescue residents trapped in collapsed buildings. The quake, the death toll from which is up to 65 currently, leveled houses and cut off remote areas from aid as freezing temperatures and heavy rain sparked fears of landslides due to aftershocks. Fortunately, though, a tsunami warning that was initially issued never actually came to pass. And the same day, however, the New York Times also reported this, and if you saw the footage of this, it was pretty remarkable. And I quote here, their headline was, plane erupts in flames landing in Tokyo, but all aboard survived. Japan Airlines said all 367 passengers and 12 crew members had safely evacuated the jet, but 5 crew members on a Japanese Coast Guard plane that collided with it were killed. And I continue to quote from this article, as flight attendants yelled, urging passengers to evacuate, an eerie orange glow burned outside the windows of Japan Airlines Flight 516. The harrowing scene was caught on video from inside the plane, which collided with a Japanese Coast Guard aircraft as it was landing on Tuesday in Tokyo. Through skill and luck, one aviation expert called it a miraculous job. The flight crew of the Japan Airlines plane evacuated, as I said, all of its passengers and crew at Haneda Airport near Tokyo Bay, according to Japan's transport minister. But 5 Coast Guard members who had been headed to help with the earthquake relief in western Japan were killed. It was revealed during a news conference. And NHK, the public broadcaster, later said that 14 people had been injured on the passenger plane. The root cause of the accident is still unknown, but, the powers that be reassured the countries that its Transport Safety Board and other agencies would work to determine what had happened. And the Washington Post subsequently reported that the Japanese officials are still investigating the cause of the incident, but flight safety experts say the role of the flight crew, improvements in plane safety designs, and crucially, the way the passengers reacted, which was calmly, would all have been key to helping them evacuate safely. So again, it's believed that both a well-trained crew and well-behaved passengers, which sounds like a Japanese translation, that, in English we might not have used the word well behaved, right? We would have said calm passengers or whatever, or obedient or something like that. Anyway, but that they both approved essential to successfully evacuating an aircraft in an emergency situation. It says the Washington Post reported another passenger told Reuters that the flight attendants told us to stay calm and instructed us to get off the plane. And just 10 to 15 minutes after the passengers had moved away from the plane, he said the whole aircraft was engulfed in flames. So there, is a near miss. So as I'm trying to, again, as I noted, find the astrological correlation for all these sudden happenings, never mind, and these are happenings that include explosions, earthquakes, fire, and stabbing or attempted assassinations. These are martial kinds of theme things, right? But also pondering the multitude of legal stories, because you guys who listen to this podcast regularly know, that's my I'm at the age where I could say, younger people would say, that's my jam, Anyway, pondering the legal stories pertaining to Donald Trump's attempts to delay his upcoming trials through legal tactics, and the announcements of the removal of him from the primary presidential ballot, the GOP primary ballot in Colorado and Maine, then that going through the courts, the appeals, etc., the resignation of Harvard's President Gay since the congressional hearing accusing her of anti-Semitism, combined with right-wing attempts to tar her with a plagiarist's brush, and all else that Jupiter implies, never mind also that Jupiter's station on December 30th came very close to the sensitized October 28th lunar eclipse degree of 5 degrees and 9 minutes of Taurus. And then I came across this from Aaron Sullivan's Planets in Transits book. Again, it's helpful to look back in order to look forward, right? So Sullivan says, and she's talking about before the station direct. As Jupiter heads back to the station direct, it encounters the decelerating quincunx from the Sun, and that occurred on November 29th, so approximately a month before the station direct. Many adjustments and revisions are required. It tends to be a busy period outlining prospective plans, but with an increasing sense of waiting and suspense. This, combined, of course, with Mercury going retrograde just after that, she says, this exciting aspect begins to collect energy and swell to tremendous proportions, creating an inflated sense of expectation. The horizon, though optimistic, is still unclear. Jupiter's motion continues to slow as it approaches the stationary direct trine. And here she means the trine from the Sun to Jupiter, which occurred after the Sun entered Capricorn, so it's an Earth trine, on December 27th, by which time Jupiter is virtually motionless. So a few days before it actually turns direct, Jupiter is trined by the Sun, which constellates and encases the gathered energy. The station therefore contains a tense, swollen force that can blow like a dam. This can be a positive release, or it can summon forth the demons. Well, if that doesn't sum up, a lot of what I just talked about, I actually don't know what does. In any case, she proceeds to say, station direct to previous station retrograde degree. So when Jupiter stations to turn direct, the Sun has been in trine to it for about 6 days, which brings an optimistic, exciting tension to the station period. The station direct unleashes blocked emotions and can result in impulsive, premature decisions. And bear in mind that, though I talk so much about collective energies, this can pertain to each of us individually, depending on where Jupiter is transiting in our chart, where it's stationed, if it's, what house it's in, if it's touching by aspect any of our natal planets, angles, or other important points, etc. So she says, the week or so leading up to the station harbors anxiety as well as excitement. Unexplained feelings of unrest can be mirrored by havoc in one's environment, and there can be a sense of anticipation and possible apprehension about what is building to climax. All of this can lend a paralytic but manic air to activities around the station direct, which again, I believe the current news cycle reflects perfectly. So clarification of what is needed or wanted will clarification of what is needed or wanted most will gradually come once Jupiter begins forward motion again. So the station direct period offers an opportunity to animate blocked or stifled creative issue. The myth of Jupiter inducing the birth of the new pantheon by forcing Saturn to disgorge his swallowed offering is an apt allegory here, because so often one is incited to extremes of action in order to re-engage one's interest or energy level. Now she's referring to the myth of Uranus, who found his children by Gaia, Mother Earth, so disgustingly ugly that he stuffed them back into her womb. So if you're unfamiliar with that mythology, it is Gaia who manages to smuggle Saturn away before he can stuff him back, and he's raised and comes back as a man and castrates Uranus, which she's likening to Jupiter, and thus frees all the rest of the gods, and Saturn becomes their leader. Saturn is sort of like the Zeus, and he rules quite well over the Golden Age. So Sullivan goes on to say the extreme opposite of Jupiter's poor influence, the Senex. So the poor is the eternal child, and the Senex is the old man, is encountered during the retrograde cycle, and though it was necessary to reserve one's energy, the conservative element is anathema to Jupiter's essence, and the planet will battle with one's interior resistance to change. So, she goes on to talk about how if it's aspecting one of your planets, then, you're going to feel it more seriously, right? When Jupiter passes back over that degree, whatever degree you have a planet at that's correlated to the 5 degrees of Taurus, whether it's by square, sextile, opposition, trine, or whatever, it may bring a new and more appropriate perspective on what was deferred, lost, altered, promised, or conceded. Conversely, if the stationary direct degree is aspecting a natal planet, then by looking back to the time about 7 months before when it first transited that degree, which if you go back from December 30th, you end up in May 30th. So if anyone wants to look back to that approximate time period, she says one can then see what is being delivered fully mature. So the station direct begins an excellent time for inaugurating a new venture or concept, because the ensuing 8 months of direct motion, although other retrograde planets may qualify this, allows for stability and growth to establish a solid base of operations in the area in which transiting Jupiter is found. The plans, ideas, and projects that were curtailed at retrogradation or implied at the first direct contact with the natal planet will emerge at direction, and more often than not with a new twist. The expansiveness dreamed of prior to the retrograde period is likely to have undergone a dramatic change, usually modified somewhat from its original grandeur. On a deeply unconscious level, a compromise might be struck during the interlude between stations, allowing for a graceful change in plans or direction. What one thought one wanted in the initial contact might not be at all what is really needed, and the true creative gift is then delivered. About 80 days after the station direct, Jupiter passes back over the degree at which it turned retrograde and begins to gather momentum again, heading towards the conjunction with the Sun. And that's going to happen, I believe it's in May. The conjunction with the Sun happens around May 17th or 18th. So, she's talking about the period roughly that culminates then. Between station direct and passage over the retrograde degree, which she says is 80 days from December 30th, the finishing touches are applied and the full maturity of a long-range picture arrives, adding a final note to the retrograde cycle. Now, I read all of that because I want you to understand how deep Erin Sullivan was and how profound, and how if we parse through it, she really gets into the details of delineating the retrogrades and the meaning of the more precise meanings of the actual gradations of the movement of the planet before the retrograde, at the retrograde, after the retrograde, and towards the station direct. So personally, I find that fascinating, and I hope that you do too. But I want to mention too that, I'm sure that people who listen to this podcast also read and listen to other astrologers' takes. And as we all know, it's going to be in January, I think it's January 21st, that 20th or 21st, that Uranus will station direct. And I'll talk more about that in the weeks to come. But all of the planets will be in direct motion. So in combination with a lot of what Erin Sullivan says, particularly related to the planet Jupiter and its station direct, is going to be appropriate for moving forward with a lot of our plans, because there won't be review. It'll be a time more of initiation or actual manifestation, right, rather than the planning. Now, I would say that obviously that's not going to be true for absolutely 100% of everyone on the earth, but, it is a general kind of understanding that when all the planets are moving in forward motion, it is time for us to move forward. So let's hope that means there will be progress on some of the world's problems, but also, again, going back to Jupiter, on these legal cases that we are concerned about here domestically in the U.S. related to who's going to be on the ballot in 2024 as a nominee for our president. So again, to go back to the recent astrological events, including, of the past week or so, including Mercury retrograde, Mars conjunction, combined with the squares of both Mercury retrograde and Mars to Neptune. And remember, Neptune, Pisces, right, was originally in traditional astrology ruled by Jupiter, and though in modern times it has more of a correlation to spirituality than to religion, in this case I think it brings in the religious theme, or it kind of echoes the religious themes that could be potentially inherent in both the stations direct of Jupiter and also Mercury, because Mercury again is transiting in Jupiter-ruled Sagittarius. And these events, astrological events, created a kind of a perfect storm leading up to now. And I want to mention that as part of that, too, we had the ISIS bombing in Iran, which, is also increasing world tensions right now, in addition to, of course, the Israeli-Hamas devastating situation in Gaza. But this is from, where is this from? This is from CBS News. It says, Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei vowed a harsh response to Wednesday's, that's 2 days ago, that's January 3rd, harsh response, to Wednesday's bomb attack on crowds gathered to mark the anniversary of the 2020 assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, as Iran observed a day of mourning on Thursday, which was yesterday. The attack killed at least 84 people, Iranian authorities said. Now, bear in mind that General Soleimani was assassinated by the Trump administration. And the CBS goes on to quote Khamenei by saying, cruel criminals must know that they will be strongly dealt with from now on. The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, claimed responsibility for the attack, which appeared to be the deadliest targeting Iran since the country's 1979 Islamic Revolution. The death toll was revised down to 84 early Thursday by the country's emergency services after initially being reported as over 100. More than 280 people were wounded, according to the emergency services. So Washington denied U.S. involvement, and the U.S. State Department spokesman Matthew Miller said the U.S. had no reason to believe Israel was involved. And National Security Council spokesman John Kirby indicated the same and said, quote, our hearts go out to all the innocent victims and their family members. Now, it says Wednesday's twin bombings occurred minutes apart in the city of Kerman, which is just over 500 miles from Iran's capital city, Tehran. A crowd had gathered to mark 4 years since the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, who was the head of the Quds Force in a U.S. drone strike. So the point I'm trying to make here is, other articles have pointed out, ISIS is a Sunni Muslim group, and Iran is a Shia Muslim country, or ruled by Shia Muslims. So the point I was trying to make when I mentioned the correlation between Jupiter and the traditional rulership by Jupiter of Pisces, and the squares that have occurred between Mercury and Mars to Neptune leading up to this, is that this essentially is a religious war, right? And that is something I don't think should go unnoticed. Now, meanwhile, and bear in mind that the things that I'm mentioning from the news, of course, I'm leaving things out. These are the ones that are hit the world stage news. There are many things that may have occurred locally, especially where Jupiter and all these other astrological aspects may have been more prominent in the chart of the country or the city or, the person involved in the incident or people involved in the incidents. I mean, there's no doubt that when a lot of people die in a terrible incident, whether it's an earthquake or whether it's man-made like this situation, that groups of people is probably generational, but also locational, right? That they were hit in certain areas, both in their individual charts, but also in their longitude and latitude by astrological aspects. Meanwhile, however, yesterday on January 4th, Mars entered Capricorn. So Mars in this sign is known as the general by astrologers because Mars' motivation is directed towards achieving a particular goal, such as winning a war. And this may have lent itself to the rationale behind Israel's recent withdrawal of some of its troops from Gaza, especially since the call-up of approximately 360,000 reservists since October 7th has decimated, reportedly, the staffs of its operations, both on the corporate side, the medical side. In other words, Israel called up all these reservists right after October 7th, and they're also normal people who have normal jobs. And so their economy is now suffering because recently this has led the departure of employees or managers or owners of businesses has led to a downgrading of the country's expected future GDP. And Israel has determined that such a hit to its economy is unsustainable. Hence, the military has sent many reservists back to their full-time occupations in order to keep the country's businesses running smoothly. And that just brings me to the kind of well-known cliches that all wars are basically economic in nature, as they say. Now, meanwhile, I think we're going to expect more confusion or obfuscation of facts as we approach the Mercury-Neptune re-square, now that Mercury is direct again, on January 8th. Though the Capricorn Sun's earthy trine to Uranus retrograde still in Taurus and Mars sextile to Saturn in Pisces on January 9th may help us focus on new revelations that help us see things more clearly via the Sun-Uranus trine and work hard via the Mars sextile to Saturn to manifest these ideas concretely by then. And when the Capricorn new moon arrives at the aforementioned 20 degrees and 44 minutes degree of Capricorn on January 11th, we'll be asked to plant seeds that lead to a greater sense of maturity and responsibility, first toward ourselves and then toward others. However, since both luminaries form cardinal squares to the transiting karmic south node in Libra and north node in Aries, but also square wounded healer Chiron in Aries, which is hovering around the north node, this lunation tells us it's time to heal any sense of self-perceived responsibility to what I mentioned before in relationship to Mars and Jupiter, a righteous cause, by continuing to act like adults rather than allowing the overwhelming need for partnership to make us feel we must compromise ourselves to feel whole, or the overwhelming need for independence to make us feel free. We have to use the grown-up, mature, serious part of our nature to understand that everyone needs to be heard and everyone needs to feel free to act. But the boundaries must be stated and drawn so that the integration of these energies creates fairness and balance that can lead to harmony rather than more conflict. Anything short of that does not make the grade. Now, Venus's fiery trine to Chiron at that new moon too can help inject a bit more empathy into current situations. We know, for example, and I've mentioned this numerous times before, that starvation caused by lack of food and drinkable water in Gaza is beginning to take its toll, particularly on the youngest, babies and children, and, of course, their mothers, or those who have been left without mothers due to Israeli bombing their fathers. I think if unrectified in the short term, the Saturn Hygeia, and Hygeia is the asteroid goddess of health, conjunction, which I mentioned a few podcasts back, which exacts in Pisces on January 16th, may well trigger the effects of such restrictions because, I'm mindful of the fact that it's not just the Israeli blockade and the lack of resources coming into Gaza to feed people and to help them medically, etc., that many people who did not die but who were wounded were tended to without anesthesia. This is one of the most painfully awful things I can think of. Reminds me of those old Western movies where the guy has to bite the bullet while they saw off his, the bottom part of his leg or something because, they give him a shot of whiskey or whatever. I mean, this is a horrible, horrible thing to contemplate, right? But that infection is going to start taking its toll. Disease is going to spread. And so I'm very mindful of that. And we'll watch to see whether this Saturn Hygeia conjunction proves, beneficial or negative in terms of the implication of Saturn being restrictive, but also Saturn, indicating hard work, right? So will there be some kind of hard work and action that takes place in relationship to the health of that area in general or not? But anyway, too, this lunation, the Capricorn new moon, may be the harbinger of the need for a steady, mature hand to steer the ship. Remember, I said Mars in Cap is known as the general, or with Capricorn's ruler Saturn currently navigating through Neptune-ruled Pisces, the admiral. So a nautical metaphor is not entirely out of the question either, right? So who will that be? Well, given the legal questions looming large in the U.S. Supreme Court, perhaps it's legal rulings concerning Trump's legal cases as we await the appellate court decision on his immunity before being appealed to the Supreme Court for a final decision, or the myriad other number of issues related to one of his other cases as people continue to provide testimony and more information is revealed, especially as Mercury direct gathers speed now and moves into Capricorn. And of course, the continuing saga of whether Trump will or will not remain on the ballot in the states that have thus far thrown him off, which I mentioned previously, Colorado and Maine. And we'll wait to see whether the Supreme Court will punt or rule on so many of these issues, but particularly on his immunity concerning his upcoming federal criminal trial, scheduled to begin on March 4th, but which has already been stayed pending some of the decisions related to that case. This also concerns jury selection, right? When a case is stayed, nothing can move forward. And Jack Smith has been making, great strides in pleading through his motions for the Supreme Court to please move quickly on this. Or also, it's about the Biden administration shepherding Congress toward bipartisan action before the first government default deadline is met on January 19th. So, there are currently two separate expiration dates for two separate sets of appropriation bills on the calendar. The first expiration date is in the continued resolution that was passed back at the end of November, is on January 19th, and that applies to the programs covered by the Agriculture, Energy, Water, Military Construction, Veterans Administration, and Transportation HUD bills. The second expiration is February 2nd, and that applies to the programs covered by the Commerce, Justice, Science, Defense, Financial Services, General Government, Homeland Security, Interior, Environment, Labor, Health and Human Services, Education, Legislative Branch, and State Foreign Operations bills. And besides extending appropriations, the measure also includes several policy extensions through January 19th for certain health care programs and a farm bill extension through the fiscal year of 2024. So, alternatively also, or in addition, it may well be about the impasse in Congress over the issue of immigration at the southern border, which is basically what has been holding up the fiscal budget reauthorization legislation. And, Mercury re-entering Capricorn, which it does on January 13th, and then will trine Jupiter in Taurus, both of them now direct, could bode well for a concrete resolution by January 19th. However, Venus in Sagittarius square to Neptune in Pisces then too creates the potential for some wishful or fantastical thinking on the part of one or both parties involved in negotiation. It's hard to tell, but it's worthwhile pointing out that it's only a small contingency of extremely right-wing Republican House members that is insisting on getting their way, right? Hence, we go back to the need for a steady hand to implement some kind of negotiation and compromise that will ultimately work out. So it was interesting to note that today, Punchbowl News reported this. We have two pieces of big news this morning, and I am recording this early on January 5th, so the same day that this podcast will drop, on behind-the-scenes machinations related to border security talks and government funding. Speaker Mike Johnson told House Republican freshmen on a private conference call yesterday, Thursday, that he may try to negotiate directly with the White House on changes to border security and immigration policy, according to multiple sources familiar with the call. The view inside Johnson's operation is that any Senate-negotiated deal is unlikely to pass the GOP-controlled House, so it may be time for the Louisiana Republican to try to open a channel for talks with the Biden administration. Let's be clear, the details here aren't fleshed out in any way. Johnson has been publicly saying that Democrats in the White House should accept H.R. 2, the GOP's hardline border security and immigration bill. President Joe Biden and Democrats have rejected this proposal. Johnson has also urged Biden to take executive actions to try to stem the influx of migrants. At this point, it's uncertain if Johnson would want to negotiate border policy changes as part of a government funding bill or a national security supplemental package, as Senate negotiators have been trying for weeks. But Johnson, who just spent 2 days at the U.S.-Mexico border, seems to want to get in the game here. So it's interesting that what I just said, may well ring true. But I want to point out also that, number one, we're still looking at Saturn in Pisces, which has begun to gather steam since it's stationed direct. Right? It's stationed direct at 0 Pisces. It's now at 3 Pisces. So we are looking at this overwhelming influx of immigrants coming across the U.S. southern border into the United States, many of them, thousands of them, having been bused to northern cities in the United States, Chicago, New York City, causing overcrowding, increased homelessness, etc., right? So we have this moving human tide, Pisces, of people who are, the Congress and particularly the right-wingers are trying to stem, restrict, and boundary GOP, Republican Governor Abbott in Texas is also going to be soon fighting a legal battle against the DOJ for having passed a law that can arrest undocumented immigrants. And I'm not sure if they're saying they can deport them or just throw them in jail. But in any case, that's easy to research. So I just want to mention that, all right, because that's an ongoing thing now. We still have like another 2 years of Saturn in Pisces, so buckle up or whatever, or a year and a half. Anyway, I feel it's also important to note that on January 19th, and this of course is after, this is the date of the deadline for the U.S. budget, the sun will be waxing towards its conjunction to Pluto at 29 degrees Capricorn, which will perfect on January 20th, which is the same day that the sun enters enters Aquarius less than an hour later, and Pluto does the same that evening. So this is a rather daunting energy that may well remain in play until the next Leo full moon on January 25th, which occurs at 5 degrees and 14 minutes of Leo, which will pit that proud, creative, family-oriented moon against the sun Pluto in Aquarius at that time, which though waning and separated by 5 degrees will still be an orb of each other energetically, which is to say that this may mean that the Leo full moon will ask the sun and Pluto to release their ideological hold on controlling others to make room to integrate a more creative solution to any kind of conflict. This will become especially true because these planets form a T-square to Jupiter, which by then will only have transited in direct motion to 6 degrees and 41 minutes of Taurus from, as I said, its station at 534 of Taurus, since it's, station direct on December 30th. So, we're looking at, just so much going on, as everybody knows. And, how we're going to navigate this, but recognizing the astrological correlation and looking at it from a more spiritual, esoteric level, while that can remove us somewhat from any pain or shock of what's happening, it at least can give us a kind of foundational explanation. And that in and of itself can then allow us to be a bit more, I guess, either to ascertain if we need to be more logical and rational or if we need to be more instinctive, and go with our gut in terms of our intuition. But either way, that's where I'm going to leave it. I will be talking in the future about what to expect over the next 6 months or so, because of course we have Pluto, as I just mentioned, going into Aquarius. We're going to have in the spring the much talked about Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, and so much more. But I hope that everyone is continuing to find this information helpful here, and I want to thank you all for joining me. I apologize for my brief absence over the last couple of weeks. Things have just been busy. I should have said this at the beginning of the podcast, but we're getting back on track now. It's 2024, and we're going to hope for better things as the world and each of us individually works through our issues, and they lead us to greater consciousness rather than to remaining stuck in old habitual patterns. So be sure to join me again on January 12th for another episode of Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking podcast. Until then, may your journey be filled with karmic healing and the joy of greater consciousness. Namaste.
Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hold. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the